Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, let's talk again about the squad. We talked last week about these 4 freshman publicity-seeking, far-left congresswomen, so I'd like to keep it short this week. I'd actually like to skip talking about them, but frankly, in light of the endless press coverage that Trump's tweets and the crowd at his North Carolina rally chanting, "Send her back," presumably about Ilhan Omar, received, I can't avoid the issue. But what I want to talk about is not to focus on the propriety of the chant. And for the record, I'd rather they didn't do it, and just for the record, notwithstanding the fact that I can't stand Hillary Clinton, and I believe she was the beneficiary of an investigation clearly biased in her favor, I don't like the lock her up chant either. The reason I don't like it is because it gives the appearance that our system of justice is subject to the whims of the mob or the crowd, and it shouldn't be. But having said that, the issues that we face today, that our entire country faces today, are far more pressing than the chants at Trump rallies. Notwithstanding that fact, the press seems incapable of focusing on the more substantive issues. One of the things that the press is particularly obsessed with doing is finding a way to label everything that President Trump does, everything that his supporters do, everything that Republicans do, except for those who oppose President Trump when they're opposing President Trump, and everything that conservatives do, as racist. I'm sick of it, and I think much of the public is sick of it as well. In a country which once allowed slavery, which fought a civil war to end that abomination, and which systematically discriminated against blacks for decades after the end of slavery, being labeled a racist should be the worst label of all. But that label has lost much of its impact because the term has been so widely misused that its definition has essentially become engaging in an act or holding a belief which does not conform to progressive thought in politics or criticizing a politician or other public figure of color. End of definition. That misuse dramatically blunts the impact of the label and does harm to the cause of fighting actual racism when and where it does exist. So let's take President Trump's criticism of the squad, which may have actually been directed specifically at Ilhan Omar, because she's the only member of the squad who wasn't born in the U.S., but he used the plural in referring to the subjects of his tweet. So it has understandably been interpreted as referring to not just Ilhan Omar, but also Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley, and also Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC. However, Ayanna Pressley was not only born in the U.S., but her parents were as well. She's an African American. So what Trump said doesn't really make sense with regard to her. And as I noted, it doesn't make sense as to Congresswomen Rashida Tlaib and AOC either. But what exactly did he say? Now, early on when he first tweeted, I saw the specific language he used. But when preparing this podcast episode, I went back online to search news articles to find that specific language to use in the episode. It was shockingly hard to find. Article after article labeled it as racist, but never actually quoted the tweets. To the extent they quoted them at all, it was only 2 words, quote, "go back," close quote. Call me picky, call me a traditionalist, but if as a journalist you're going to write an article and label the President of the United States as having made a racist statement, if you have integrity as a journalist, if you're committed to informing your readers, listeners, and viewers, you will actually quote what the President said, so that those reading, listening, or viewing can understand why you reached the conclusion that the statements were racist. That apparently is expecting too much of journalists today. I would take it even further. If you're actually a journalist rather than a commentator, you shouldn't even reach a conclusion in your writing about whether the tweets were racist. Instead, the role of the journalist is to report the facts regarding the tweets to the consumers of the news and let them reach their conclusion about whether the tweets were racist or ill-advised or nationalistic for that matter. So with all of this background, what exactly did the president say in those tweets? Well, I finally managed to track down the full text, and this is what he said. Quote, "So interesting to see progressive Democrat congresswomen who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, the worst, most corrupt and inept anywhere in the world, if they even have a functioning government at all, now loudly and viciously telling the people of the United States, the greatest and most powerful nation on earth, how our government is to be run." Close quote. So now you see why the tweets don't make sense as to any one of the four other than Ilhan Omar. She's the only one, quote, who originally came from countries whose governments are a complete and total catastrophe, close quote. Moreover, as I noted, Ayanna Pressley was born within the 50 states, and incidentally, so were her parents. AOC was also born within the 50 states, as was her father, and her mother was born in Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory. Rashida Tlaib was born within the 50 states as well. Coming from a Palestinian family, her mother and father were born in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, respectively. So President Trump was referencing progressive congresswomen, and he did use the plural, who purportedly originally came from countries with severely dysfunctional governments, if they even have governments at all. That statement would be correct as to Ilhan Omar because she was born in Somalia, a country whose government is indisputably extremely dysfunctional, and some could argue non-existent. As to AOC and Pressley, not only does the statement not make sense as applied to them, because they were each born in the United States, but their parents were as well. That leaves Rashida Tlaib. She was born in the U.S., her parents were born in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and those locations are certainly subject to criticism regarding the functionality of their government, although effectively controlled by Israel. But that level of dysfunctionality doesn't really rise to the level of something that is arguably a non-existent government. When you examine the statement as a whole, it really looks like it was directed at Ilhan Omar. Did President Trump, or whoever assists him, make a mistake with the tweets when referencing congresswomen in the plural? Perhaps. To the extent any journalist or commentator would actually delve into that issue, my suspicion is that he would conclude that he deliberately mixed in persons who were born in the U.S., Pressley, Tlaib, and AOC, because he wanted to take advantage of some assumption on the part of purportedly racist Trump supporters that the three congresswomen weren't born in America because of the color of their skin, or in the case of Tlaib, the religion she practices. To any journalist or commentator who would reach that conclusion, I would say you need to recognize you're in the 21st century and stop assuming ill intent based on beliefs that were common decades ago. I think there's a significant likelihood that the tweets were a slip-up and a bit sloppy because they cast a net which cannot cover 3 of the 4 members of the squad. But regardless of whether it can, were the tweets racist? No, they weren't. They weren't in any way based on the race of the congresswomen in question, whether directed solely at Ilhan Omar or directed at all 4 members of the squad. The tweets did not call for congresswomen to leave the country and never come back. They called for congresswomen to leave the country and go back to countries from which they were purportedly originally from, which are suffering serious problems, much more serious than those here in the U.S. Fix the problems, and then come back here to the U.S. and show us how to fix our problems. Now, we can argue about how reasonable the tweets were. We can argue about whether they were rude or imprudent. And we can certainly argue about whether they were not presidential, at least according to historical standards of the 20th century. But what isn't arguable is that they were racist. They simply weren't. Race wasn't even mentioned. Does anybody really believe that if a white member of Congress had been born in London and spent their time in Congress aggressively seeking publicity and consistently criticizing the history of the United States, the conduct of the administrative agency ICE, referred to ICE detention facilities as concentration camps, supported the BDS movement, which calls for boycotts against the United States ally Israel, and routinely insulted President Trump and his supporters. Do you really think President Trump wouldn't compose a series of tweets telling that member of Congress to go back to London and solve their knife crime epidemic, which in some months has actually placed the London crime rate above that of New York City? Of course he would. Let's talk now about what, if anything, the tweets accomplished. Well, those on the left might say that they resulted in Trump being labeled as racist by the news media, Democrat leadership, Hollywood personalities, and the angry left that lives on Twitter. In other shocking news, the water's wet, the sky is blue, and I still can't fit in the pants I wore when I moved to Florida over 30 years ago. What a shock! So if they didn't accomplish anything for the Democrats that they didn't already have, what did they accomplish for President Trump and the Republicans? They made the Squad the unofficial faces and unofficial voices of the Democrat Party. For more than a year, we've been hearing from many in the press that electability against President Trump was the key for the Democrat presidential nominee. That has certainly been the argument that Joe Biden and his supporters have been making. Now, two things have occurred. The first is that the ever leftward movement of the candidates running for the Democrat nomination, most recently evidenced by the first debate, and everyone on the stage raising their hands in response to the question as to whether they would provide government health care to illegal immigrants. And now, with Democrat leadership having run to the defense of the Squad, leftism has become the ideology publicly perceived as the ideology of the Democrat Party, and AOC and the rest of the Squad are now perceived as the faces of the Democrat Party. Was this deliberate? Was that the result that President Trump intended? Well, what's his background? He's a branding expert. He's an expert at creating public perceptions. His actions have helped create the public perception that this handful of extremely leftist progressive politicians now represent the Democrat Party in America. The media would have you believe that President Trump is destroying the Republican brand. In reality, through actions that seem clumsy and which the media and his detractors label as racist, President Trump is destroying the Democrat Party brand. And some in the Democrat Party recognize it. The American people chose President Trump through the Electoral College, and by playing for the reaction of the Democratic Party, he's destroying the Democrat brand. You can argue about whether the Democrat brand is being destroyed by Donald Trump's actions, which prompt the Democrat reaction which damages their own brand, or whether it's the Squad itself and all of the other Democrats who just can't seem to get their far left under control. Regardless of which is the case, in a scene reminiscent of the final act of Ghostbusters, the form of the Destructor is either Donald Trump or AOC and the Squad, and the Democratic Party brand is being destroyed. And on a positive note, whether you depict Donald Trump as the giant equivalent of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man rampaging through Manhattan as the city equivalent of the Democratic Party, or you depict AOC doing so, this would make for a great meme on Twitter. It's a long way to the election, and the disruption that would turn everything on its head would be a recession. Hopefully, for reasons which obviously go well beyond the political, I hope one doesn't happen. Assuming it doesn't, I've talked in the earliest episodes of this podcast about the concept of a preference cascade. That moment when huge numbers of people who've been expressing the views that they think they're supposed to express and keeping their real views secret suddenly realize that their secret views are held by massive numbers of people. Preference cascades typically happen in dictatorships where the government has suppressed free speech, and the penalties for expressing thoughts contrary to the government view are severe. In America, it's not the government doing the suppressing. It's tech media giants. It's corporations who fear the left-wing outrage mob or who view things from a leftist perspective. It's the media which will describe in the worst terms traditional conservative or Christian views. People are holding their tongues regarding issues like abuse of the refugee asylum system, building barriers on the border, allowing transgender females who are biological males to compete against biological females in women's and girls' sports, standing during the national anthem, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance before meetings and school, waiting until the legal process is complete before reaching conclusions about a police shooting, criticizing schools which severely restrict Christian practices but go out of their way to facilitate Muslim practices, and shocking numbers of hate crime hoaxes which go unreported by the media when found to be hoaxes, and a host of other problems for which those from the right that voice conservative views face severe labeling, social, and potentially career-restricting consequences. I believe the numbers are in the millions, and they include large numbers of traditionally Democrat voters. The Democrats had a chance to save them, to keep them within the Democrat fold. That chance is fast disappearing. And what happened this past week with Trump's tweets and the Democrats having to run to the defense of AOC and the rest of the squad accelerated the speed at which that chance is disappearing. I'm starting to really look forward to the 2020 election. Next topic. Moving to where it gets done. As you know from prior episodes, I'm concerned about how easy it is to live in a bubble these days, socializing only with those who agree with you, reading, listening to, and viewing only commentary with which you agree and news which supports your own opinions and point of view. As I've said, we can avoid the problem to some extent by making a commitment to listen to a significant amount of news and opinion from sources which differ from our own opinions and perspective. But what about socializing? If you live in a very conservative or very liberal community, it can be difficult to find friends who disagree with your political views or perspectives. It's a significant problem for many of us, but it's an even more serious problem for government employees. Employees of the federal government need to have perspective. That perspective can't be limited to the views of Washington, D.C. We're a massive country, and our diversity isn't limited to race. I've had some of my most enjoyable political meetings in Washington, D.C. and in the New York City metro area. I've also had one of my most enjoyable political meetings eating boiled peanuts and barbecue in Cairo, Georgia. It's spelled like Cairo, Egypt, but pronounced like Cairo syrup. If I was from any other country and knew nothing about America, and I attended one of those meetings in Washington, D.C. or New York City, and then attended the meeting in Cairo, Georgia, if you interviewed me while I was eating my 400th boiled peanut, I probably would have said it seemed like I was in a completely different country. Now think about employees of the federal government living in Washington, D.C., trying to understand the needs of citizens spread out across this massive country. Think about the pushback within the European Union at bureaucrats in Belgium who don't understand and arguably don't care about the needs of citizens spread across Europe. Now think about the federal government agencies in Washington, D.C., which primarily serve states in the West, the most removed from Washington, D.C. by distance and to some extent by local culture. Well, Donald Trump was thinking about it, and he's doing something that's long overdue. He's relocating significant numbers of the federal government's employees in Washington, D.C. to locations in the heartland. Specifically, he's moving offices of the Department of Agriculture and Department of Interior. Within the Department of Interior, most of the employees of the Bureau of Land Management are being relocated, large numbers of them to Grand Junction, Colorado. The Department of Agriculture is moving offices to the greater Kansas City area. Think about it. If there's one thing that doesn't occur in significant amounts in Washington, D.C., it's agriculture. In fact, aside from Michelle Obama's garden at the White House, I'm not aware of any. But Kansas City is right in the middle of the country. I'm not sure you could be more centrally located from an agricultural perspective. Maybe the employees of the Department of Agriculture that had been in Washington, D.C., will be more likely to focus on the needs of wheat farmers rather than the wheat content of the latest trendy Witbier craft beer at a D.C. microbrewery. What about the Bureau of Land Management? Well, its primary functions are to oversee public lands and issue permits for oil and gas drilling. As you can no doubt imagine, the vast majority of that activity occurs west of the Mississippi River. Public lands in particular are nearly entirely within the western United States. Frankly, in my view, few, if any, of the Bureau of Land Management employees should have been in Washington, D.C. to begin with. Not surprisingly, union representatives have objected to the moves, and no doubt the popularity of those moves within the organizations is limited. But you know what? We in the private sector have had to deal with this issue our entire lives. I once had a company that I was working for, and had worked for many years, relocate to the center of the country as well. I considered the relocation offer and then turned it down. There is no reason that federal government employees should be insulated from those difficult decisions that the taxpayers who support them must face all the time. I trust that choosing to listen to this podcast is not a difficult decision for you. I'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. We're not moving. You can find us in the same places you always have. So please join me and tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.